So, good morning and welcome to my occasional series about the recorder. Now, those of you with long memories will remember that last time we reached the dizzying depths of concert D flat, in other words, a nice Baroque sixth flute in D at A415. And after that, those of you of perception and forward planning will think, he's going to go on to the descant recorder. Now, descant recorders, nice, sweet things. Concertos are written for them. There are a number of surviving Baroque originals, and they're absolutely lovely. And you might think, good, we're going to go from the darkness of why I dislike small recorders to sweetness and light and Van Eyck. But there is going to be no sweetness and no light and certainly no Van Eyck, because I'm now turning to a chamber of horrors, which I think has not been explored much before, namely the school recorder. Screams. Now it's possible that Dante Alighieri, in his vision of hell, could have included a circle in which poor teachers were chained to a wall of granite while an endless succession of young people wandered past playing London's Burning on badly tuned descants and then joined all together at the end. However, Dante couldn't have made that up because the school recorder didn't exist when he was around. For that, we have to move to the 20th century. So what happened in the 20th century? Well, the only person really making decent recorders was Arnold Dolmetsch. But over in Germany, people were making recorders, once again in small numbers, not as good as Dolmetsch's. But post-World War I Germany was a place of enormous optimism, as we know. They had a new government, they would shortly have a new leader, they were rearming, they'd invented autobahns, they'd invented Volkswagens, everything was going well. And the one thing they did do in 1930s Germany was that the children were absolutely almost deified. The children were the future of the race. They had to be nurtured in everything, and that included music. But of course, when you're trying to unify musical education across an entire country, you need an instrument to do it with. Now, we know what happens normally when you mix children with instruments. Keys get bent, strings get broken, guitars get trashed against sound stacks. So, enter Peter Harlan, an educationalist, and he was looking for an instrument for his Wandervogels. Now, the Wandervogel was the wandering bird, the idealized German youth who would go out into the woods in his lederhosen and his rucksack and play little German folk tunes. None of this decadent stuff, Strauss and Mahler, which of course was being banned by the Nazi government. So he needed an instrument that children could play, that could be produced in large numbers cheaply and could survive a week in a damp rucksack with cheese and sausage and still come out and play tunes at the end of it. So he chanced on the recorder. But of course, where to get recorders from? Dolmetsch's were expensive. They were made in England. There were a few recorder makers in Germany, but they could only produce handmade instruments. And then up popped the industrialists, because the industrialists said, well, look, we just invented this wonderful new process. It's called injection molding. And we reckon in injection molding, if you want 10,000 descant recorders, we can turn them out for you in a matter of weeks. And that'll be fine, won't it? You can hand them out to your Wandervogels and they can wander into the wild. Now, Peter Harlan thought this was a wonderful idea, and so he commissioned industrialists to make these things. Now, of course, the industrialists didn't know anything about recorders. As far as they were concerned, if they'd produced a tube with 8 holes in a nice cardboard box with a pretty picture on the side and a fingering chart, they were doing a good thing. There was no design brief except make this children's toy, and so no doubt half a dozen designers at half a dozen different factories produced things that were really had no consistency whatsoever. However, in 1930s Germany, recorder mania was really taking off. The German youth movements were playing recorders. It was the official educational instrument of the Nazi Party, and Peter Harlan, who apparently was quite always looking for a good business opportunity, set himself up to supply this demand. Now, I've been collecting school recorders. I went on eBay a few years ago and looked around, and I thought, oh, that looks interesting, let's have that for a few pounds. And I have in front of me, I'm not going to show you the entire collection because it would mean moving the camera, but I have in front of me a large selection of instruments that I bought off eBay. And I'm going to take you through some of these absolute horrors. Are you ready? Here we go. Now, actually starting with something quite nice. The first injection molded recorders were produced by Adler. This is one here. Now you can see it's got a Bakelite head and a rosewood body. Little brass ring in the middle. This is obviously from the same stable. This is completely made out of Bakelite, little brass ring at the middle. It's also, as you might be able to see, it's got German fingering. Now, German fingering was invented by Peter Harlan because it made life easier. You just picked up one finger after another, no cross fingerings. But we also know with German fingering that the instrument cannot be played chromatically. But we didn't need that because we were only going to go out into the woods and play folk songs on it. Now, strangely, these recorders are actually quite good. They play a nice scale. I'll just give you a scale. That's a nice scale. That's actually not a bad scale at all. Here's the other one. Not bad at all. And you think that's promising. The only rather odd difference with these recorders is the bottom C. Which are almost a semitone apart. I don't know why, but that's the only tuning difference in them. Now, I'd like to talk about pitch a bit because everyone thinks that pitch was always the same. Well, pitch wasn't always the same because in the 1930s, pitch was all over the place, all over Europe. In Germany, it was high. In France, it was low. And if you were an orchestral player, you had to carry several instruments around with you, depending on where you were going to go and play. So in 1939, they had a pitch conference in London in which they decided that modern pitch was going to be A440. We've all come across A440. Now, why was it going to be A440? Well, looking it up, and once again, I can only collect sketchy bits about this pitch conference. The problem was that the BBC wanted to broadcast an A440 tone, but with their newfangled sine wave generators, they couldn't do many pitches without interference. And A440 was one of the ones they could do. They couldn't do A439 for some reason, so A440 was set upon. Now, just to digress a bit, if you've never heard of the A432 conspiracy theory, it is worth looking up the A432 conspiracy theory. Now, the A432 conspiracy theory states that A432 is the harmony of the spheres, the planets, the human brain, everything rotates according to multiples of 432. And 440, now I'm going to quote from one of these conspiracy theory sites. There are many of them. It's not my quote, but just gives you an idea of the sort of things that are said. These destructive frequencies, A440, entrain the thoughts towards disruption, disharmony, disunity, and dysfunctionality. They also stimulate the controlling organ of the body, the brain, into disharmonious resonance, which ultimately creates disease and war. Look them up, they're fascinating. Now, this was of course blamed on the usual suspects like the Rothschilds and Goebbels, especially Goebbels, because the idea was that by introducing 440 into the world would be prepared for the German invasion, because everyone's thoughts would turn to war. However, having stuck on A440, no one actually bothered to tell the recorder manufacturers that they need to standardize their pitch to A440. And now I'm going to carry on showing you some instruments because they are really terrible. Now, the word shots, very well known in the recorder world. Everyone's probably got one of those pale brown shot concert recorders somewhere in a cupboard. But they were one of the first people who started producing school recorders. And I have here in front of me 5 recorders that are all stamped Shots C Descant. They vary from this one. Now this is plastic, it's not Bakelite, I'm not sure what it is. It's modern fingering because these were being produced in England and modern fingering was adopted in England. You might recognise this thing. Nearly everyone played one of these at school of my generation. They're made out of maple. The turning is absolutely awful. The bore has to be seen to be believed. We have another one here. The turning is even worse. We have this little plastic bit at the top which also incorporates the labium. And by now, with this one, the little plastic labium is gone. We still have the plastic beak, but the Shots recorder has acquired a kite mark. So let's have a and there's this one as well. Oh yes, this is absolutely the worst. This is also marked Shots Descant, made in England. It is truly horrid. It has a very strange beak with a big hole in it. The proportion is completely wrong. So let's have a play on some of these recorders and see what we get. Let's have a play on this one. This one actually isn't too bad. No, that's the one that's dreadful. Sorry about that. That's absolutely appalling. It hardly makes a noise at all. Let's play this equally horrible plastic one. Slightly beepy sound, but at least it does make a noise. But let's move on to these wooden ones. And this is where I would like to point out some of the very odd things that were happening on school recorders. Here we go. This is the plastic one with the plastic edge. Hardly any sound at all. You can't imagine a musical child being inspired by that. Kite mark. Not really nice either. And then this one, strange yellow plastic block. Now those of you with an astute ear might notice that there's something a bit odd about these recorders. Now what I'm going to use as a pitch standard today is a Yamaha plastic recorder. These were designed by von Huner and they're good, really nicely in tune. We probably all played one of those. So I'm going to use C as my standard. I would use a tuner, but you wouldn't be able to see the needle on this. So here we go. Here is a C on a nice Yamaha Descant. Let's assume that C is correct. Now let's go back to our Adler, a semitone flat. Now perhaps we can think, okay, this was made before the Great British Pitch Conference. Perhaps that's what they were tuning them to in those days. The other Adler, the same. Let's just play a few notes together. Bet that made you run for the kettle, didn't it? Well, when you come back, that is the sort of noise that we learn to love from our memories of school recorder groups. So let's have a look at the C on these Shots. This is a C on the plastic one. Not bad. This one. Ooh, about a semitone sharp. This one. Flat. This one. distinctly flat. This one, about the only one that has a C that we recognise. So, if we take, no, which was the really flat one? Excuse my continuity here. This one. That one's really flat. That one's really flat. So you can imagine you've got all your kids in your school and they've turned it with a mixture of these instruments and they're all trying to play them at once. And once again, we get the same sort of impression. And you think, well, they're all made by Schott. They must be all right, but no one's paying any attention to pitch at all. It's absolutely terrible. Now I'm going to move on to a couple of other instruments here that I acquired. Here we have, what's this? A recorder marked Fischer, made in Bremen. Not bad at all, actually, so the Germans could make them. Here we have a wooden body and a Bakelite head as well. The Hornby, a famous make of recorder, a famous make of English toys. What have we got here? Also not terrible. Now this is a funny thing. This is the Rossetti, made in Germany. A very, very odd plastic head and a big, bulbous, probably stained pearwood body. Heaven knows what they were thinking of. Also not bad, so why couldn't Schott do it? Now, we have here the Dulcet Tudor. Quite heavy Bakelite sort of material, once again made in England. Now, that sort of lulls you into a false sense of security, but I'm going to go on to my chambers of horrors now. Now, if I'm an industrialist and I'm sitting at the end of my production line and picking up what's just come off, I would probably like to think that I was proud of that. I thought, this is a nice thing, I'm going to put this in a box and everyone's going to pull it out and think, oh, this is wonderful, isn't it? What a beautiful thing, I'd love to give this to my child to stick it in their mouth. So, here, another Dulcet recorder. I couldn't believe this one. I thought, well, is it actually for real? Now, look at this. The head joint is made out of plastic. It's bent, it's distorted. The moulding is absolutely appalling. It doesn't match with the centre joint at all. The edge is dreadful, and here we are, Dulcet, made in England. If I was an industrialist and I picked this up off the end of my production line, I think I just want to go and throw myself in the Thames, quite honestly. Let's see if it works. Sort of works, but once again we have a very flat recorder. Not as bad as some of the others. Now, I'm just going to mention something before I forget. You remember how I said I hated sopraninos? Now, I have very few sopraninos, but one of the sopraninos I do have is this little chap here. Now, this is a tuju block flute. And tuju, you've probably seen tujus, they were very common. Merck made them up until quite recently. And I just forgotten to digress on this, but when I was talking to Alec Loretto in the 1990s, we talked about tuju, and I said we all wanted, is it a sort of wood? And he said, no, 2Ju stands for something like Tour und Jugend, which is Tower of Youth, and that was directly relating to the German youth movements. It's interesting that Merck dropped the name 2Ju soon after that story got out. So where are we? A couple of other things. The Enford school recorder. Absolutely horrid thing. Bakelite head, wooden body. Now, schools, of course, were stuck with these. They had boxes full of them, all sorts of different pictures, and you can imagine that when they came out, they could hardly be played together in tune at all. I sometimes do a talk on this subject with people at the SRP and recorder courses, and at the end I hand out a dozen of these recorders to a dozen recorder teachers and say, right, let's play London's Burning. We don't get very far because the whole room just collapses in hysterics after the third or fourth grossly out of tune descant comes in. And I think you can see that because the people who made these things had absolutely no instruction as to what pitch they were to be made in, as to how the ball worked, as to how the voicing worked. This is one of the reasons why we have that monstrosity, the school recorder, and why the sound of school recorder groups is just dreaded and feared throughout the known universe. Now, before I go, I'm just going to go on to a couple of other subjects on descant recorders. The Americans, of course, went their own sweet way and produced things that were really quite odd. This is the Aman recorder made in the USA. It's heavy plastic. It's got raised finger holes. It's got a very odd, very small bore at the end, which you can't really see, but with this big flare that's completely unnecessary and doesn't do anything at all. And it works all right. Quite nice, actually, the Aman school recorder. But of course, the Americans also produced things like this. Now, this is the floutophone. Any fans of Dr. Seuss will recognise this sort of style. I love floutophones. I've got 3 of these off eBay, and one of these days I would like to get 2 other like-minded people, and we can dress up like the Cat in the Hat and go around playing floutophone trios at children's parties. I think it would be great fun if there's anyone out there. It has a thumb hole, so it's definitely a recorder. This is an American marching band instrument, and I understand it's still marketed as such in the States. This is what it sounds like. Doesn't play the Star Spangled Banner. Floutophone. Isn't it amazing? The last horror I'm going to pull out is something I also bought off eBay, and this is also American. Here we are. It comes in your cardboard box. What does that say there? King of them all. A musical opportunity for everyone. This is upside down, that's terrible. A musical opportunity for everyone. It's fun. It's easy. It is the Symphonette. You too can play the Symphonette. Made entirely of strong, durable plastic, chromatic 2-octave range, thumb rest like a saxophone. Wow, that's amazing, isn't it? Ridges between holes to guide the fingers, music holder attachable, adjustable mouthpiece for tuning purposes. And you get this for your child for Christmas, and the child thinks, oh, thank you very much, that's absolutely lovely. And what do they pull out? We have a fingering chart. Develop your musical talent. And look at this thing. Isn't this just the most horrid example of injection moulding you've ever seen in your life? It's bent, it's distorted, it has no design quality to it whatsoever. I really don't know what on earth the person who designed this was thinking about. It's a recorder, it's got a hole at the back. Let's see what it sounds like. It's absolutely appalling. The Symphonette. It's fun. Everyone can play music with it. You give your child one of these and they'll just go off and take up fishing instead, I think. And now I'm just going to mention a couple of things. The toy recorder. There is a proliferation of toy recorders nowadays, and they are absolutely horrid. They're produced in China. They're glaring neon and fluorescent colours. They're sold in Mothercare. Now, you can imagine if your child goes to school and the teacher says they've got to have a recorder. Mum will think, oh, where can I get a recorder? And someone says, oh, they sell them for 99p down at Mothercare. Off she goes, and she comes back and she gives her child one of these. And little Johnny is ever so proud of this. He thinks it's absolutely wonderful, and he goes off to school and proudly shows his recorder teacher, look what my mummy bought me, it's a recorder, just like you wanted me to. And the recorder teacher takes a deep sigh, because she knows what this is going to sound like. Shall we play a scale on it? If we can. The thumb hole is quite a few millimetres below the first hole, the bottom hole is in a straight line. Octaves completely out. It barely works. Let's go back to our Yamaha. That's my Yamaha gone. Here we are. And it's grossly flat. How can you tell little Johnny to take it back to her mother and say that's no good? Especially since someone like little Jenny has turned up with her grandmother's beautiful Dulcet descant and is trying to play it in the same group. Absolutely awful. Now, if I'd been really clever, I'd have done an a cappella version of London's Burning with all these recorders, and it would just have been complete chaos, but I'm not that clever. And the very last thing I'm going to produce, my prisoner that will never be let out. Here we are. Look at this. Isn't it horrid? The Groovy Tunes recorder. It's a very thin plastic skin. The hole inside here is just completely hollow. I don't want to know what it sounds like. I'm never going to take it out of here. It's going to be like Woody in Toy Story. No, the prospector in Toy Story, never released from his box. On the back it says, here we go, do not use close to the ear. Misuse may cause damage to hearing. I would think it would cause damage to quite a few other things as well. I would like to cause damage to it, but I won't. I shall just keep it safely locked up. The school descant recorder. I hope you enjoyed that. Next time I might look at some decent descants. Enjoy the rest of your rainy day.